Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So at this point, I think it's undoubtable that the prospects for the war expanding, the war between Russia and Ukraine, expanding to other places on Earth, could absolutely happen. We are seeing right now the North Koreans. The North Koreans are rattling their sabers. They have discontinued the peaceful prospect of a Korean unification, meaning that North Korea believes the only way forward is through military means. And they are directly saying, as they have said for quite some time, that the South Koreans are their primary adversary. So why now are we seeing this rhetoric from the North Koreans? Well, I can tell you why. Most people, most of the mainstream media reports that Western Europe, the United States, is the primary arms supplier to the Ukrainians. And yes, the United States supplies Ukraine with significant amounts of weaponry, both munitions, ammunition, and weapon systems. But there's one important aspect to this conflict that is not talked about in the mainstream media. It's not mentioned. So we know that the Ukrainians need roughly, or would like to have, 90,000 rounds of 155 millimeter artillery per month supplied. Obviously, the Russians conduct deep penetration strikes throughout Ukraine, destroying a lot of these ammunition depots. So this continued supply of 155 millimeter rounds, which is rapidly becoming the most used round by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians use the M109, they use the M777, and a host of other NATO-supplied 155 millimeter howitzer systems. The problem is, for the United States and Western Europe, is that they cannot produce enough 155 millimeter artillery rounds, per month. Thus, the United States has to tap into existing stockpiles of 155 millimeter rounds and then give them to the Ukrainians. That then depletes the U.S. stockpile of 155 millimeter artillery shells. The United States cannot produce more than roughly 10,000 artillery shells per month. The Ukrainians are either using or having those destroyed in Ukraine in excess of 10,000 rounds per month. So you have a deficit. So if the United States hands over this stockpile of 155 millimeter rounds, it's going to take some time for the U.S. to shore up that stockpile back to existing amounts. And especially if there was another large near-peer war, such as a war against China, if there was a large-scale expansion of the current conflict, the United States could be in a predicament. So how is the United States working around this? It's the South Koreans. The South Koreans have a massive arms industry. They can produce more 155 millimeter rounds than the entirety of Western Europe. The Western European arms industry has completely atrophied. completely atrophied. The major arms contractors here in the United States have atrophied as well. The United States went through many years of counterinsurgency war. So if you go back to the 1980s and you look at where we're at now, the United States is a former shell of itself in terms of arms production. The Chinese can produce vastly more in terms of ammunition and munitions than the United States could ever dream of producing right now. The United States is ahead in terms of the production of next generation stealth aircraft, but that basically is where it ends. Outside of that, in terms of producing massive quantities of ammunition for a lot of these weapon systems, especially artillery, the United States is lagging greatly behind China, even Russia. So the United States right now is what is happening is taking possession of hundreds of thousands of rounds of South Korean 155 millimeter artillery shells. That is also depleting South Korean capacity as well. So the South Koreans are giving the United States 155 millimeter rounds. The United States then gives the Ukrainians its existing stockpile of 155 millimeter rounds and then shores up that stockpile and just transfer to the Ukrainians. Now the problem is one of the reasons why we're not seeing a renewed inflow of ammunition to the Ukrainians is that the only option next would be to take the South Korean 155 millimeter rounds and then ship those to the Ukrainians. The problem is that the South Koreans signed an end-user certificate with the United States, meaning, hey, we will shore up your stockpile of 155 millimeter rounds, but you can't ship those 155 millimeter rounds to anyone else. You have to maintain control of those. So therein lies the challenge. The United States handed over to the Ukrainians large amounts of 155 millimeter rounds. They have given the Europeans large amounts of 155 millimeter rounds and other munitions as well, because the South Koreans produce a broad spectrum of both weapon systems and ammunition systems, probably on par with the United States. It's an incredibly industrialized nation state, South Korea. That is why we're now seeing this saber rattling with the North Koreans. The North Koreans obviously are allied with the Russians. Both the Russians and the North Koreans, the Chinese, see the United States as an adversary. And if the South Koreans are handing over large stockpiles of 155 millimeter rounds that would normally be used in a large-scale military conflict against North Korea, that could be a problem for the South Koreans. Now, at the same time, we're seeing the North Koreans supply weapons and munition systems to the Russians as well. So it's this vicious cycle, this never-ending cycle of war. And one war, such as this major war that is happening between Russia and Ukraine, reverberates around the world. It has a cascade effect, much like other wars throughout history. So we're in year 2 now of this war between Russia and Ukraine. It has no sign of stopping. In fact, it's probably going to escalate. We believe that the Russians are preparing for a massive winter and possibly late summer offensive against the Ukrainians. As I've talked about before, the Russian military-industrial complex is rapidly expanding. The challenges that the Russian military had at the start of this conflict in regards to manpower, specifically infantry forces, that is no longer the case. Many believed after 6 months of war that the Russians had lost so many armored vehicles it was going to be difficult for the Russians to resupply many of its ground maneuver brigades and divisions. That's not the case either. We're seeing the Russian military expand and get bigger. The Russian military that exists now is bigger than the Russian military that existed prior to the invasion of Ukraine. The Russians are tripling, quadrupling the amount of missiles, the amount of tanks that they are now producing. They are receiving active support from other nation states. People often hearken back to World War II and say, hey, look, the Soviets would not have been able to do what they did against the Germans had the British, had the United States and the other allies supported the Soviet Union. Now, the problem with that is in the modern era, they're acting like Russia does not have allies. They do have allies. They have allies in terms of natural resources in Africa. They have industrial allies such as China, North Korea, a growing Iran. So that support, that same support that many Western analysts discount in terms of, well, they don't have the same support as they did in World War II, meaning they, the Soviets or the Russians. Well, they do. It's just not the United States, as the United States is now the adversary. It's China. It's the other major industrial power. And as I talked about before, China can outproduce the United States right now in terms of artillery systems, ammunition, weapons. Outside of some very advanced systems such as nuclear-powered attack submarines and much more advanced stealth multi-role aircraft, which the U.S. still has a qualitative and quantitative edge in terms of production values, the Chinese exceed the United States in those other areas of production, and it has to be accounted for. Intelligence. A lot of folks tend to listen to and read reports from the Institute for the Study of War. That institution is very biased. They have come out and proclaimed themselves allied with the Ukrainians. Thus, they do not, the Institute of Study of War, does not provide insight. They don't provide analysis to the Ukrainian situation, and they reason that as, well, we accept that we are fundamentally allied with Ukraine, thus we are not going to reveal the true nature of the dire circumstances that the Ukrainian military is in right now. So there's really no analytical sources that currently exist in terms of the mainstream, where just an ordinary person would do a cursory search and try to gain real insight into what is happening. That is why I do this channel. I try to provide an unbiased, clear view into what's happening. And I try to give the perceptions of both the Russians and the West as well. So again, very interesting to see what's going to happen in the weeks and months ahead. It is going to be a very, very trying time for both the West and Ukraine. I don't foresee the Ukrainians getting a lot of support from the United States for a multitude of reasons. And then there's obviously the U.S. elections in November, which I have great concerns about in terms of instability happening here in the United States, which I believe is going to happen one way or another. So again, just the whole South Korean equation, why we're seeing what's happening in North, I wanted to have a discussion on that. I hope that provides insight. Again, South Korea is a pivotal partner in the Western strategy against the Russian Federation. A pivotal partner. And oftentimes that is overlooked and not discussed in the mainstream media, partly because South Korea doesn't want that information to get out. South Korea fully understands it is a pivotal partner in the ongoing war against the Russian Federation. It knows that. But that information is something that the South Koreans, do not want to become common knowledge. So that's where we set for today. We will have more very soon. As always, thanks for joining us. We're going to do another synopsis on the prospects of war between China and Taiwan soon. Have a good day.